Honorable Chair, distinguished panel, senior officials, and dear friends. My presentation today, titled Counter-Radicalization, Conceptual Confusions in an Ideological War, actually deals with the ideological issues. There have been people who have been asking me to speak more on the measures we should be taking to counter radicalization. Probably in that respect, my paper deals with that in greater detail. And last year, I gave here a presentation at the IDSA, where I talked about the social and institutional reforms. Probably that could be more helpful in that regard. But I'm just, because it is an inaugural lecture, I'm focusing mainly on the conceptual part of it and some of the difficulties which we are facing these days because of some of our own making in trying to understand the phenomena and into some of our own semantical constructs which are hindering rather than facilitating our fight against radicalization. So it is my paper, which is titled Counter-Radicalization, Conceptual Confusions in an Ideological War. It seeks to highlight some of the glaring confusions, inconsistencies, and at times self-defeating criticisms that impede some of our counter-radicalization discourse and programs, even as exponents of violent extremism continue to spread their message of hate and terror through archaic channels or so-called new media with virtual impunity. Here the famous verse of the Nobel laureate W.B. Yeats readily comes to mind. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Perhaps the problem lies with the asymmetry between the rational and strategic outlook of many counterterrorism experts and the sub-rational and emotive appeal of the purveyors of hate and terror. It must be understood that terrorism is essentially a brutal form of psychological warfare, because it is almost never fought on any conventional war front, but is almost solely focused on inflicting grievous harm to the public psyche and the collective cognitive. In fact, the incongruence of its methodology is not limited to the battlefield, but mainly plays out in the psychological and ideological domains, wherein reason is confounded by hate and anger, peace and harmony with terror and uncertainty, and civilized discourse with acerbic vitriol. Thus, the scourge of terrorism does not merely pertain to the number of innocent lives it kills, maims, or violates, but to its impact on universal human values and rational faculties that forces even the common and moderate elements in society to eventually question the viability of established ethical codes and basic humanitarian principles of civilized life. In fact, terrorism in our times is no longer just a tactics of war, but has turned itself into a philosophy of violent nihilism, which in the case of organizations like the ISIS extends to an end-time apocalyptic extreme, seeking the annihilation of modern civilization at the peril of human existence itself. It is this ironic cutting edge of violent extremism that continues to bedevil strategic experts of conventional warfare, who currently appear to be struggling against the asymmetry of ideological, psychological, and faith-impelled violence. In fact, there exists a lot of confusion and inconsistency in the efforts of the international community to combat violent extremism, as there is still no consensus over a universally acceptable definition of terrorism, with a few countries even calling some forms of terror as good, as they mistakenly believe it serves and promotes their national interests. Surprisingly, there is also debate on whether the term radicalization, which refers to the ideological process through which an ordinary individual gradually becomes a violent extremist, has a positive connotation to it, as it allegedly projects violent extremism in a favorable light. It is claimed that the word radical questions the traditional, the trite, and outmoded ways of thought and action. However, much of today's terrorism, particularly jihadism, is said to be a product of atavistic discourse, and so attaching the adjective radical to such fundamentalist and obscurantist ideals is patently incorrect and misleading. In response, counterterrorism experts like Peter Newman, averred that the word radicalization has come into use in the absence of the word extremization in the English dictionary, and that its currency is not inappropriate as modern terrorists are radicals seeking the violent overthrow of existing socio-cultural and geopolitical order. But more importantly, some counterterrorism experts like Rick Colsett and Arun Kundnani question whether ideological radicalization should be considered an important cause for the spread of terrorism. This school of CVE scholarship points to empirical studies that show that most terrorists often never receive formal indoctrination and do not undergo a process of radicalization before joining any extremist or terrorist organization. It is argued that many of them usually join radical groups for a variety of non-ideological reasons, such as criminal affiliations, familial ties, or a juvenile tendency to seek a rebel identity during the formative years of their life. Thus, experts like Olivier Roy contend that most incipient terrorists suffer from a sense of identity crisis or a degree of socio-political alienation, real or perceived sense of discrimination, psychological disorders, and even unexplained adolescent or midlife crises, and that many are never entirely convinced of the avowed ideals and goals of their own extremist persuasions. Conversely, some experts like T. Hagerman make the argument that often highly radicalized people never become terrorists. They point to several opinion polls conducted over decades that show large sections of population, even in developed countries, often support radical extremism and use violent slogans, even though they may never themselves participate in violent acts. It is also contended that both terrorism and extremism are linked to contemporary political or social grievances rather than ideological or religious motives per se, while others like Randy Borum and Schmidt believe they are related to dynamics of social movement and social psychology, albeit very little work has been done by counter-radicalization theorists to explore the psychological dimension and the character arc of a typical terrorist. Some social activists and counterterrorism experts even question the need for governments and security agencies to expend a lot of their time, effort, and resources on so-called countering violent extremism and terrorist programs, CVET, aimed at de-radicalizing or rehabilitating violent extremists, because there are hardly any empirically verifiable or quantifiable measures to determine the effectiveness of such initiatives. As CVET is still in its infancy, with about 40 countries running their own separate and indigenously developed counter-radicalization and de-radicalization programs, questions are raised about the basis for conceiving and conducting such novel forms of experimentation. In fact, several CVET measures currently in vogue in Europe, the US, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia have come in for intense criticism and controversy from social activist groups, sections of the media, and the very communities they seek to rid of the menace. There is also a lot of misperception over concepts and terminologies developed by counterterrorism experts themselves. For example, the terms counter-radicalization, anti-radicalization, and de-radicalization are often bandied interchangeably, even in academia, and it is only recently that a degree of consensus has evolved to link these terminologies with clearly identifiable sets of measures employed to reverse the process of radicalization in different stages of their life cycle, with characteristic behavior, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Thus, it is now largely believed that anti-radicalization refers to a set of measures directed at protecting those segments of population that have only recently come under the influence of radicalization. Thus, anti-radicalization measures relate to early detection of trends towards violent extremism and radicalization, as well as developing immunity and deterrence against the propagation of hateful and violent indoctrination. Similarly, counter-radicalization now specifies those measures by government and civil society that seek to combat the threat of radicalization in communities or societies that are already in the grip of violent extremism. Thus, counter-radicalization measures are designed to target those individuals or segments of society that are susceptible to or are in the process of joining forces of violent extremism or terrorism. The measures suited to counter-terrorism operations include disengagement, rehabilitation, and reintegration programs. The third set of measures pertain to de-radicalization programs, which treat violent extremists during their period of imprisonment or incarceration, so that they do not practice or propagate ideas of violent extremism once their jail terms end and they have to be released from prison due to legal compulsions. Thus, de-radicalization programs are solely devised for those individuals who have already been radicalized and may have committed, aided, or attempted to commit acts of violent extremism. Thus, de-radicalization measures cover post-surrender and post-detention programs such as behavior modification programs, ideological or religious counseling, vocational education, recreational and psychological rehab, interreligious or intercommunal discourse programs, post-release surveillance and care, as well as involvement of family members and civil society to foster rehabilitation, etc. However, there is still ongoing controversy among CVET experts in determining at what point does an ideology or an individual becomes extreme enough and fit for a counter-radicalization referral. Or more broadly, how does a society inoculate or guard itself against a radical idea, particularly those ideas that may not overtly spew hatred or provoke violence, but may insidiously gnaw at the cohesive structures and foundational values of composite polities and societies? Again, does extremism thrive in isolation, or should both extremes of a polarized society be targeted by CVET programs, even if one of them is currently more violent or radical than the other? In fact, this issue has spurred a heated debate in the United Kingdom, where some leaders of the Muslim community, like Miriam Francois Serra and George Galloway, who for all intents and purposes appears to be a Muslim, complain that by solely focusing on Muslims in that country's Protect De-Radicalization program, the government has inadvertently radicalized other sections of society who now look upon Muslims as a suspect community, even as white supremacist groups have been kept out of the counter-radicalization ambit. There is also criticism that some Arab Gulf countries offer materialistic sops to dissuade young neophytes from joining terror groups. But this tactics has proven both practically ineffective and is said to be ethically unjustified. In spite of all these allegations, controversies, and conceptual inconsistencies, it would be important to note that most CVET programs around the world have done a lot of good in spite of there being still work in progress. In fact, their successes should not be gauged by their respective rates of recidivism, but should be measured in terms of the number of real or prospective extremists rescued from the scourge of violent extremism, with many of the reclaimed having now joined security agencies in the fight against terrorism. To understand the importance of CVET programs, it would be important to note the reasons for their origins in the recent past. The need for counter-radicalization first arose in the aftermath of 9/11 attacks and the US-led Iraq War of 2003, when thousands of religious extremists and radical youths were arrested, convicted, or imprisoned in various countries. As most of them could not be prosecuted for serious offenses, it became problematic to keep them behind bars indefinitely. In fact, the problem became more acute after the Madrid bombings of 2004 and the London bombings of 2005, as governments found it difficult to explain how their own people had conducted acts of mass violence against fellow citizens. It was at this time that several governments launched exclusive CVET programs to check the spread of radical ideas in their societies by violent non-state actors. Notwithstanding the many confusions and criticisms of CVET programs mentioned above, there is ample evidence to conclusively establish the link between terrorist organizations and ideological radicalization of vulnerable sections of society by certain state and non-state actors for definitive political or militaristic ends. Most terrorist organizations invest heavily.
You already done 15.
Yes, sir. I'm about to conclude. Yes, I'm about on my way of concluding it. There is ample evidence to conclusively establish the link between terrorist organizations and ideological radicalization of vulnerable sections of society by certain state and non-state actors for definitive political or militaristic ends. Most terrorist organizations invest heavily in highly sophisticated forms of propaganda, ranging from indoctrination in seminaries to online radicalization, training, and even recruitment, through which they seduce impressionable minds into conducting acts of indiscriminate violence. It is because of such extremist indoctrination that madrasas in the Afpak region were once supposed to generate Islamic scholarship, ultimately converted into mujahideen producing factories in the war against the Soviets in 1980s, and that process has continued to the detriment of world peace to this day. It is this extremist radicalization which is reflected in the very formation and the name of the Taliban, and is a clear illustration of how ideological radicalization leads to formation of terrorist groups. Similarly, it is the extreme Islamist literature of Sayyid Qutb, Muhammad Faraj, Taqiyuddin Nabhani, Abdullah Azam, Muhammad al-Maqdisi, and Abu Bakr Naji that radicalized the minds of present crop of terrorists in Al-Qaeda and the ISIS. As jihadist movements continue to spread their message of violent extremism around the world with virtual impunity, the time has come for counterterrorism experts to get their act together and develop effective political, social, religious, and psychological counter-narratives and strategic communication programs at the head of improved counter-radicalization and de-radicalization strategies. It is time that countries collaborate to develop effective means of information dissemination to deliver various forms of ideological and religious counter-narratives, many of which are detailed in the table here. A wide range of experts from all walks of life need to be roped in for the success of this enterprise, including religious scholars and historians, public relations professionals, information and communications technology experts, intelligence officials, counterterrorism and PSYOP specialists, as well as social activists and community leaders to develop more sophisticated counter-radicalization programs. More importantly, government should clamp down on organizations preaching philosophies of political extremism, particularly those using religious and communal concepts as part of their violent political campaigns, as such organizations are the breeding grounds of violent extremism and terror. Thus, instead of getting bogged down in conceptual confusions and at times the casuistry of semantics, the time has come to make the present ideological war against radicalization, to take the war against radicalization to the opposition, not only through greater cooperation and coordination of international CVET activities, but by reviving and reinvigorating our commitment to universal humanitarian and liberal values, which alone could ensure and promote the future of our globalized society. Thank you very much.